Hello everyone, it's great to be here with you again. If you're not fed up of my face on your screen already, you're very welcome to join us this evening. At this point, I'd like to welcome the other speaker, Liz, who is going to pop on her camera and her microphone for us. Hi.
Hello, Melanie. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yourself?
I'm fantastic, thank you.
Good. We're going to start with a couple of bits of housekeeping, and then we'll get straight into our conversation, which has been a long time coming. But for everyone tuning in, my name is Melanie Hollis. I'm one of the collections and learning curators at Ipswich Museums, which is part of Colchester and Ipswich Museum Service. And if you need an audio description, I've got white skin, blonde hair, blonde straight hair, and behind me is quite a boring dark wood cupboard. Liz?
Hello, I am Liz Pemberton, and I am an early years anti-racist trainer and consultant. And for the purpose of audio description, I am a Black woman sitting in front of a bookcase with a Black Lives Matter poster behind me and a grey fireplace. I have black hair that is back in a bun.
Thank you, Liz. It's really lovely to be having this conversation with you after such a long time. And I know we're live on YouTube. We've made a decision to turn off comments, but actually we'd love people to start their own conversations using the hashtag Power of Stories. And I'd also suggest hashtag Formidable Liz.
I like that.
I love that one.
Nice.
This is more exciting than talking to David Olusoga, I have to say. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Shall we go back to how we first met?
Please,
in 2020. So for a bit of context, maybe, my most recent work as a collections and learning curator, although I've been a learning officer for many, many years at the museum, is working as part of the team on Power of Stories, which is an exhibition and also a lot of engagement activity around it, which really explores the power stories have and how people have used stories for many different purposes over millennia. And at the heart of that exhibition are three iconic costumes from Marvel Studios' 2018 film Black Panther. So when in 2020 we were all kind of absorbed in our digital worlds, I saw a link to an article called Wakanda Forever. I clicked. And not only was I hooked by the title, but then also absorbed by what you said in that article. And I think it sort of went from there. I feel like it was a Twitter DM that started it all.
You did the age-old sliding in my DMs, Melanie, and I was really happy that you did do that and you slid right in and we started a conversation which turned into many conversations and also kind of stimulated both of us to really deep dive into the motivation for me behind writing that piece, Wakanda Forever, which was for Nursery World, which is an early years sector publication, just around the power of narratives and how we really centralized listening to primarily racially marginalized children. And my focus was really thinking about my own experience as a former nursery manager in an early years setting, which predominantly served children and families who happen to be Black, African, Caribbean and brown. When I say brown, I mean children and families whose heritage is rooted in South Asia. And what it did in terms of pushing narratives forward, which I think are usually unheard. The stories of those children of families who have been marginalized and have been ostracized by society in general. And I really thought about some of the things that I'd heard over the 16 years that I'd been managing that nursery, and some of the things that we as a team of practitioners and early years professionals, things that we really focused on in terms of giving us an indication as to the lives of children outside of that 7:30, 6 o'clock bracket, Monday to Friday. And it's always been very powerful, very insightful, but also really important, and how we valued those stories and let those stories, those narratives feed into what we kind of did in terms of an element of planning for learning opportunities for the children whilst they were in our care, because it became an integral part of what we did. We always kind of focused on, which many early year settings do, focus on the child at the centre, at the heart of everything that we did, but thought about that extra amplification and that hypervisibility of Black and brown children in the UK context under 5.
It's powerful stuff, and the article, if you haven't read it, is still online, and I'd recommend it. What really grabbed me about it was there were so many parallels between the early years sector and the sorts of points you were drawing out, and the museum sector in general, early years within that as part of learning and engagement and representation. But one of the things in particular was around, you described early years provision, and I'm going deep straight away here in that article. You describe, I've got it written here to remind me, you describe early years provision as a microcosm of the wider systemic discrimination and injustices that we're experiencing right now in the world. And that stuck with me because David Anderson, who's director of Museums Wales, has recently said something really similar about museums. He has said museums are a micro utopia of public good. So, we have this underlying purpose to educate or inspire. But in practice, they're a micro dystopia of embedded inequality. And so thinking about those two together and how that article really, for me, showed how there are overlaps and how these issues are systemic, that's where I wanted to talk to you more and to really look at the power of stories, because as museums, we're storytellers. And, we need to be reflecting on that responsibility as you are doing in the early years sector.
Yeah, and I always think, sorry, Melanie, I just was thinking as you were talking, but that struck me in terms of, being storytellers. Whose stories are we telling? Whose stories are museums platforming? And through whose lens? Because there can be an argument for, which is a very valid argument, stories that we are told through a specific lens. If we're thinking about museums, if we're thinking about the arts in general, if we're thinking about what the arts and museums are embedded within, we have to think about it in that wider systemic sense. We can't look at it in isolation. And so I had to kind of just jump in there just because you talked about, the story. Whose story? I always ask who and why.
Absolutely. I had a similar point, which I would have brought up later had we not already touched on it. I had who as a really big question, and our community curators that we worked with on Power of Stories brought this up multiple times, and I think it's a Zimbabwean proverb originally, but it's talking about the lion telling the story. So I'm going to actually read it so I don't misquote it. It's lost it. Here we go. Until the lion tells their story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So that kind of gets to the crux of the matter. But I'd go one step further, because that implies that the lion's got to do all the work.
And it is that, isn't it? Who is the lion? Who are the hunters? Who is the hunted? Who are the marginalised group? Who are the people who are marginalising? And we think about the power of language when we're thinking about narrative and story, of course. And I think in the early years, much is spoken about with regards to the unique child, the voice of the child, and amplifying that voice. But again, it's that question, who is responsible for the amplification? And who and how are we interpreting the voice of particular children? How are different children and families discriminated against based on a range of things, including, of course, racialized identities? But we have to look at disability. We have to look at the intersections of socioeconomic groupings. We have to look at where children and families are living, how they are living. Are they part of communities which are demonized? I think of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community. I think about all of these things as we're looking at whose stories are we listening to, whose stories are put in front of us to listen to and to pay attention to. If people in control of pushing those narratives forward do not have the children's best interests at heart, whether that be knowingly or unknowingly. And then we get into a conversation around bias, something that I don't, really love. It doesn't sit well with me when we talk about this notion of unconscious bias. I think we have to be very, very ready to think about how conscious we are when we're looking at children and families. And as I said, giving space for different stories and narratives to be told, using the children's voices. And I think when I wrote that article, Wakanda Forever, lots of things were going on in my mind about the power of the child's voice, the power of the Black child's voice. As a woman who's racialized as Black, as a British-born woman who is of Jamaican heritage, both of my parents were born in Jamaica, I think about all of those different things, those components of my identity that bring me to this space now, and also bring me to the work that I do in a professional sense. And I cannot conveniently put one away for the sake of another. They all coexist in the space at the same time. So coming to this work now as an anti-racist trainer and consultant in the early years, again, it brings up these questions around identity and narratives and stories, and how I choose to kind of come to that work as my whole self. I cannot appear on this screen as anybody other than myself. For those who can see me, they can see that I am Black. I stated, in terms of the description, my pronouns are she, her. And I think thinking about that is very important, but bringing that into a space is even more important. The hypervisibility, conversations around representation cannot be ignored and shouldn't be ignored, but should also be given space to have nuanced conversations as well, because I think that's what's missing in a lot of these conversations pertaining to the power of narratives, the power of children's narratives, and that nuance around whose voices we're hearing, which children's voices we are giving space to.
Do you think, what are your thoughts on how early years frameworks and things are developing? I don't claim to be an expert on them. That's why you're here. But I did read something that made me think, and that was about the shift from children being empowered to tell and create their own stories towards perhaps a more narrow view, which was children retelling stories. And then obviously you get into the issue of which stories they're provided with in the first place, right?
There you go. And we get into that wider conversation again around systems, power, control. And again, this thing around how we are interpreting the documents that we have. And so we have a range of statutory and non-statutory documentation that we have access to in the early years sector. And of course, that non-statutory guidance is there to support and to help to scaffold. But the way in which narratives or stories, literacy, reading, writing, talking, conversation, the way in which that's framed, again, can be interpreted in so many different ways. And that's why we have to be really, really sure about how we are looking at resources that we have in our settings. But more importantly than that, how much time are we taking to educate ourselves as early years practitioners? And when I say educate ourselves, I mean educating ourselves in the areas of equity, in the areas of anti-racist practice, in the areas of thinking about, you can have all of the Black books that you want in your early years setting, you can have all of the Black dolls that you want, you can celebrate Diwali, you can celebrate Lunar New Year, but what underpinning knowledge do you have? What lived experience are you bringing to that? And if you don't have the lived experience, how are you lending yourself to a community who should be leading in those areas? How are you doing that willingly, with an open heart and mind, and also with the vulnerability and understanding that you're not going to know everything as an early years practitioner, and being able to reposition yourself as the learner and not the teacher is, I think, a key thing about working in this sector. When we're thinking about children leading and we're thinking about children being the initiators of their own creation, of their environment and their experiences, that conversation around the co-creation also should come up. So how are we co-creators in the early years sector, and how are we using the documentation that we have to support that properly? And also, how are we being critical about what we are given? because we should also understand that that documentation, some of that comes from the government. And of course, we have to understand that the early years sector cannot be removed from the political stance of where we are at the moment and the political climate. So to assume that the early years exists outside of that is naive, it's silly. We shouldn't do that. We know that the early years, of course, it's political. The early years is a reflection of what's happening in wider society. And of course, the people that work in the sector are also members of the society, and we are encouraging children to be independent thinkers. We should be encouraging children to celebrate who they are in all of their richness and their individuality. We need to move away from conversations that talk about seeing all children as the same because they share a racialized identity or they may share a disability. That's a really narrow, flat, reductive way of looking at children, remembering that children are humans, they are people. And so that same nuance that we lend human beings, adults, we should also think about that in respect of children. And that's why I say it's so key to listen to the individual voices of children. If we don't do that, we are going to be walking in this really dangerous territory of just stereotypes, as I said, reductions, missing out on that beauty of individuality and being able to truly, really celebrate that in a non-tokenistic way, because tokenism is something that's often brought up when I'm delivering webinars, when I'm delivering training, when I'm working with early years settings and local authorities about, how can we be anti-racist? Liz, what do we need to do? As if there is this list that I can hand out or this tick list. It is not that kind of work. This work is deeply embedded and it requires you to kind of be in that space and allow yourself to do that deep dive on yourself. It's quite individual in that first instance.
To be able to sit with the discomfort it causes for people racialized as white, that is going to be uncomfortable work. And it's not something you just manage to achieve one day. It's a constant and ongoing reflection. But that discomfort is good. That's where you learn, right?
Oh, that's what we train children to do.
Yeah. If we expect, you say in the article, if we're expecting children to take risks, then we should do the same. Absolutely.
We have to. That risk taking is important.
Are you seeing the changes that you want to see? Are you starting to see it?
I'm starting to see a willingness to come to the conversation. I paused there on purpose, Melanie, because I'm really reflecting on a lot of the things that have happened over the past 18 months. And of course,
for sure,
the summer of 2020, it brought out a lot of different feelings and responses, a lot of feelings and responses by people from where I was sitting, by people racialized as white. And there was almost this, many people have spoken about this shock and this horror, as if the murdering of a Black man by an institution such as the police has not been happening forever and a day, as if this was new. And what we're noticing now is, again, this resurgence of shock and horror about the way in which institutions such as the police are treating women. And again, it lends itself to a bigger conversation. Whose voices are amplified? Women have been talking about the inequalities and sexism for a long time, but because we're embedded within a patriarchal society, those voices aren't always given the space, and then we find ourselves to be here. But if we break this down even further and we look at the racial disparities, the racial inequality, we have to then have a conversation about which women's voices are listened to. And it all feeds into the same thing. When you ask, has there been change? There has been a willingness to have a conversation. In terms of the actions, I don't think that's something that I can really hand on heart say, yeah, actually, this is brilliant. And everybody wants this hopeful, happy ending, or this moving in the right direction. Everybody wants that, and they want that from people that look like me. And all that is, again, it's about centering whiteness, isn't it? It's about that comfort, providing that comfort to let you know everything's okay now, because you started having a conversation, because people put black squares up on their Instagram last year. because some of us have started reiterating the fact that Black Lives Matter. I'm not here to center whiteness, to make people racialized as white feel better. That's not why I do this work. It is to continue to kind of think about that long-standing systemic oppression that is happening to lots of racially marginalized and minoritized people globally. But I guess for the purpose of my work, namely in the UK, because that's the context, the cultural context that I live in, and where the majority of my work takes place, in the early years space.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important point to make. Thank you. Shall we have a think about, you said you've been doing a lot of kind of looking into the presence of museums in early years frameworks. And so that's obviously something I'd like us to talk a little bit more about. What have you noticed and what are you thinking?
I've noticed that the word museum pops up a lot.
We think we're important.
Who is this group of people who've decided that museums are the place that all children need to go to learn, to visit, that it's an important integral part of early childhood? I have mixed feelings about that. And again, it comes back to this question about who is writing these pieces of documentation which is informing practice, and the presence of the museum being there for whom and why. So I guess when we're looking at a canon of things, we look at literature, we look at the arts, we look at theatre, we look at museums, we look at all of these things historically where they have been placed and the importance that's placed upon them. We also know that there's a conversation there that comes up about class and access and also value. Who is to say that we should all value a trip to the museum, and why? Is it as important to every family? No, I would argue that it's definitely not, certainly not. And in the work that I am currently doing in terms of delivering lots of workshops and facilitating discussions with early years practitioners about, for instance, I ask, going to the museum, was that a big integral part of your early childhood, now that you are people who are looking after, caring for, educating children? And by and large, the answer is no. Some early years practitioners, depending on what part of the country I am delivering in, or socioeconomic delineations, that comes up as something that divides people. Some people know people didn't go to the museum until they were in their early 20s because it wasn't a space that they saw was welcoming for them, or a place that they thought they could go in, or not even realizing that perhaps museums are free and were accessible and open to all. And some practitioners had vivid memories of going to art spaces, museums, and visiting them, but had the thought occurred to them to bring children there? And sometimes the answer to that has been no, but our guidance says that we should. So we've actually now started looking at how we can get into museum spaces. And interestingly as well, Melanie, the invitations that have come my way to speak to people like yourself who work in these spaces to talk about how can we make these spaces more accessible? What can we do to get more Black children and families through our doors? And is that the right question that we should be asking? Who says that they want to come through those doors? Who said that that's
a lot of assumptions, right?
Yeah, a lot of assumptions. Has there been any conversations directly with people from varying underrepresented, minoritized communities about access and whether it's something that is of interest? Am I going to go into a museum space knowing the history of museums, the history that we cannot shy away from, because the truth is the truth, isn't it? And we can't skew that to suit our own agendas because it doesn't sit comfortably with us about why things are in museums and how they have come to be there. That is a really important question. And so if we are using museums as a mirror to reflect certain histories, why? You know, why are we doing that? And how are we interpreting that if we're coming into that space, particularly as children forming their ideas about the world and who they are in that world, by going to a museum to show them what and where is the value in that. They're the questions I think we need to ask. There has to be, back to this conversation about co-creation. Are we co-creating this space? Or is it a space that has been created by a group of people deciding that they know what's best and what's right for another group of people? I think it's problematic.
You're dead right. And when I said earlier about museums having a responsibility as storytellers, if the story you're telling is omitting the lived experience of many, many people, or, and I can't decide which is worse, or if there is a worse, misrepresenting them. You know, telling that story on our terms, like you say, co-production really needs to factor in. And that is certainly one of the ways I try to approach curation. So I'm not trained as a curator, but as a learning and engagement officer, by the very nature of that work, you sort of have to meet people where they are and do a lot of listening. And so when you take that into curation, and there are some wonderful curators out there doing wonderful work in this field, I try to come at it knowing that I'm not the expert, and knowing that there are many other people who are, and giving that space over. And I recognize it's a privilege that it's my space to give. Like, I'm happy sitting with that discomfort. But it's, you know, there are people out there who know things differently, who know things better, and they are their stories to tell. And it's only through doing this together and sharing whatever power I have that we get to some kind of equitable story. Well, that's at least what I try and aim to do.
It's important. It's important, isn't it? Because you, in that statement, you recognize so many things, and it's almost like it's this peeling back of the layers, isn't it? Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you start to unpack this box, whoa, what a big box. What a lot of things that you have to take out, and start recognizing it every moment. Oh, you know, who am I to be in space and position to be giving? Why should people feel that they need to come to me to take? Why should it be that? And how do we look at equity when we're thinking about museums and children? I don't take away from the fact that experiences should be open to and for everybody, and accessibility should be for everybody, but I question the motive. I question the way in which things are presented without that collaborative approach. There are so many phenomenal Black and Brown and Southeast Asian creators, artists, curators, brilliant people who are in positions to lend their own understandings and experiences from their own communities to a wider audience that is dominated at the very upper echelons of British society by people that tend to be upper middle class, racialized as white and men. And that is something that has to be challenged. We need to have the conversation about how we disrupt these structures that have been so firmly in place for a long, long time. And we see lots of conversations that are happening at the moment with, you know, the National Trust and what's happened as a result of this being challenged, you know, where the National Trust is positioned, the brilliant work of many people exploring why we need to ask certain questions and why we need to reframe these conversations to relay the history, the facts of the matter.
Yeah. And I wanted to pick up there. You were talking about representation and belonging, and not making assumptions that people even want to be there in that space. And there was a question that you particularly wanted to talk about when we were discussing what we'd cover in this conversation, which was about the museum space being implicitly seen as a white space. And it really made me reflect, because the key part there is implicit. Like, we're not, well, most of us aren't saying explicitly on the label, you're not welcome here, it's not for you. But actually, through our methods of display, through the ways in which we work, so targets, lists, funding applications, all of those systems, we're actually perpetuating those ways of working and those barriers. And so it just really made me reflect. And I know that in recent years, so I started my museum career in 2007, and was fortunate to kind of enter a world where we had lots of money at that point. I think it was Renaissance in the regions. So museums had lots of money to play with, which was marvelous. But all of the kind of early years stuff predates me slightly. And I looked back, and as far as I can see, and there are people out there who have much more experience of early years in museums than I do, but I tracked it back to the effective provision of preschool education project and report. And that was the earliest mention of museums that I could find. And that was about the concern for supporting parents as primary educators, the first educator is in a child's life. And how museums were seen as one of a small group of activities which would raise your intellect scores and your social behaviour. It maybe goes earlier than that, but that's the earliest I could find it. And from there, you start to see the Every Child Matters policy, early years framework comes in, so you start to see it hopefully progressing, but you see iterations of it. In which museums, like you say, are there, but we're not questioning why. And I just go round in circles with it, really, because it's such an interesting thing that I would never have really critically analysed. And it's really lovely to have the opportunity to reflect on it, actually, critically. It's really crucial. Is there anything you want to add at this point on?
Yeah, absolutely. To know that the presence of museums for children and the presence of museums being put into documentation, that has come from a decision in a room, a working group, a think tank. That has come from somebody in a space. And I am in those spaces quite regularly now within my capacity as a trainer and consultant, and a trainer and consultant who is somewhat revered and celebrated and respected, and my opinion is sought in lots of different spaces now. Interesting. And I've been working in education for now, 17 years, not only in the early years, but also as a secondary school teacher. I'm a qualified secondary school teacher. And so when I was teaching, I taught health and social care, childcare, and I taught drama as well. And my background actually as a person in the arts, I've always occupied spaces which have been predominantly white spaces in my professional life. And so it's interesting now being invited to such meetings where we're discussing policy, we're discussing documentation, we're discussing equity, and now we are discussing race and anti-racism, but discussing race and anti-racism from the perspective of a Black woman. Very interesting, because I'm often one, if not one of two, Black people in these spaces where decisions such as, oh, what about museums? Those decisions are being made, those conversations are being had. And if there's nobody there to actually challenge that or to offer a critical lens, these things just are taken as a given. And then the assumption is made, oh yeah, all children need this, all families want this. Based on what? you know, and that's why I say these things become really problematic, because we've not opened this out, we've not co-created this, we've not spoken to different communities in different spaces, and we've not even been able to be reflective enough to stand back and think, who are we in this space? Who are we? What have we done? And how have we liaised with lots of different groups and kinds of people? Do these people want to liaise with us? Do these communities want to? Am I the best person to speak to this community? You know, how do we broach that? Because what I wonder is in these conversations that I've been invited to, which is so, you know, in and of itself, it's very funny. I find it funny. Being invited to have conversations, to sit at a table, it really piques my interest, because as I sit in these spaces, all of these thoughts are going on in my mind. And then I just don't control my mouth, and I just say it as it is. And I offer my critique and my perspective, which, yes, initially it's going to interest people, but I know eventually it will lead to possibly my exclusion from such spaces, because I know how this story goes. I have lived this story vicariously through other people who have occupied this space, who have looked like me. I have the beauty of being part of a family whereby my mother, who started her early years business in the late 80s as a Black woman, a dark-skinned Black woman in an area in Birmingham called Bearwood, which historically has a real deep-rooted history of racism, you know, not too far from where Enoch Powell gave his Rivers of Blood speech. So the history that's associated with the work that I'm doing and how I've come to this work, it never escapes me, and I cannot separate myself from it. I understand my position and I know why I'm here, but I know also what has had to happen in order for me to get to this space. And you come to this understanding that you also have a choice and a decision about what conversations you partake in and what conversations you don't. Certain conversations I'm not interested in having. I will do what I need to do. And I've been lucky to be able to create spaces that are actually really important for Black early years professionals to kind of think about our positionality and some of the decisions that we might make, which will influence, again, future generations of early years practitioners who are racialized as Black, way after, you know, I've gone, and some of the other fantastic people that I've been working with, namely, you know, Laura Henry Elaine and Jamal Carly Campbell, Just Cambridge Simmons. You know, we created something called the Early Years Blacklist for this purpose, to offer an alternative narrative. There is another version to this, and we must have that conversation as well. So I think there are many layers to it, Melanie. I'm sorry there are no short answers, but these are
I'm
the
not
thoughts,
looking for them.
you know.
Yeah.
These are the thoughts that I have, but equally knowing that as a woman who's racialized as Black, that I also cannot speak on behalf of the British East and Southeast Asian community, which was really, really overlooked within the early years space. And I think, you know, to this end, I also want to kind of speak about an organisation called Be Seen, the British East Southeast Asian Network, which is led by a collective of amazing people, one of which, Viv Yao, who I have been working with and talking to about the lack of representation within the early years space in the UK for, again, similarly to me, the children of people who have come to this country and are British. We are British. We also need to have a stake in what is happening with the education and the care of the children that we have, or children who are also sharing in our cultural, ethnic, racialized identities. You know, so thinking about the fact that historically, as a sector, the sector's always celebrated different festivals in this nod to multiculturalism, this thing from the, you know, late 80s, early 90s, you know, that's the done thing. Says who? You know, why have we got this happening time and time again? This obsession with, I always talk about this, but it's something that really stuck with me, particularly after having conversations with Viv about this notion of celebrating what is commonly referred to within the early years sector as Chinese New Year, you know, which should be correctly referred to, I guess, as Lunar New Year. Where and who is leading this practice and why? Again, we need to approach this critically. And how are we liaising with and co-creating and collaborating with our communities, our East Southeast Asian communities, particularly in this time, you know, the time of COVID, where we've seen a rise in anti-East Southeast Asian attacks, racially motivated attacks. What are we doing? We've had so many conversations in the past 18 months around allyship and being there to advocate for racially minoritized and marginalized groups. And, you know, what are we doing? Well, what are we doing? But also, what conversations are we having? Where are those conversations taking place? And if we are not in certain spaces where these decisions about put museum there is happening, how can we really disrupt? You know, we need to be disrupting some of these things which have been presented to us as just a given. That's just the way it is. It isn't. It's not everybody's truth.
Yeah, there are other ways, other options, and it requires people like me to do the work, do the listening, do the reflecting, to recognize that there are people out there who can do these things just as well as us. Like, dear me, yeah. It runs so deep though, Liz, doesn't it? And like you say, until you see it, you don't see it. But once you do, maybe the penny drops, or you start to think more, and then from there you go forward and do better. I know for me that turning point was when I had my third child, and so that was the point at which I became the mother of 3 under 5s, which was a fun year. But my third child was born with disabilities, and until that point I had led a very privileged life. You know, my first 2 children were born very healthy. We'd had very smooth early childhoods for both of them. And then suddenly things changed. And this whole new experience that I just hadn't registered with me before changed all of our lives. And now I see, now I see that there are so many people who just are looked over, ignored, marginalized, and the version of normal that we're trained to accept is so narrow and damaging. And so now with a disabled child going into early years provision, one of the questions I was asking was, how are you representing her? You know, how are you allowing her story to be told and her truth to be part of what the children learn? And I remember one evening picking her up and the nursery manager saying, all the parents are wondering why the kids are coming home with Macton, like they're using Macton at home. And once she'd explained to them that it was because they had a deaf child at nursery now, you could just see the penny drop in all the parents as well. It's like, oh, okay. Well, so a little adjustment on our part has meant that this one child is having a much more enriching experience that is more accurate. And I suppose the point I want to make is representation is not just about the person being represented in terms of them seeing themselves reflected, but it's about everyone else seeing more things as normal. How would you reflect on that as an early years professional?
Well, it's so important, this very narrow view of normal. Again, we have to challenge it. What is normal to you is not going to be normal to me, might not be normal to another person who's racialized as Black and gendered as a woman. So when we're looking at normal, you know, the conversation around language and looking at difference and other we have to critically analyze that as well, looking at how we reposition our lens. And it's about that, widening the lens, but also having a deeper understanding. And that requires a lot, as you said earlier, a lot of listening. It requires more than empathy. It requires real human exchanges and experiences which are going to take you out of this comfort zone. We can all be very comfortable. It's the easiest way to get through life, isn't it? People don't want challenge. As human beings, we are programmed to just want to have an easy life, which is the fastest, quickest route. And we see that represented in so many different ways, Melanie. When people come to me and request book lists and request resource lists, they want the quick, easy fix, because that will suddenly, decolonize their early years space. And I think we have to really challenge that as well, that where this language has come from and what our understanding of decolonization is in this context, that it's been, again, reduced, flat packed, presented to us as something like, oh yeah, everybody can get that. We have to think about where this language is employed from and how we are getting to grapple with the understanding of this language. And the same thing is around normal, what is so implicit and what is not explicitly stated when we are saying normal. Because for many of us, I remember reading this quote once, and it said that white supremacy is not the shark, it's the water. It is everywhere. We are embedded within a system and a societal way of doing things which we accept as normal. And it isn't normal. It is a version that has been presented to us that we just readily accept because we do not want to critically assess and access and dismantle it. And when we are living within a society, a world where, and a country where the government is telling us that we also shouldn't be critical, that we should just accept things for how they are, that further reduces our ability, I guess, to want to sometimes challenge things or want to question things, because then there's a fear factor added. And we see that happening with disability. We see that happening with conversations about race and racism. We see that happening within institutions of education which are, seen as top tiers. So if we look at our top universities and our top schools and who is accessing this, the implicit thing that is there and it's ever present is the notion of who gets to access such spaces, without realizing, I guess, or accepting that the people that are occupying those spaces then go on to be decision makers for the rest of us. And we are supposed to just sit down and accept that as normal. And so I think what the pandemic, of course, has done, it's exacerbated all of these things, isn't it? Exacerbated, rather, and made us look at things in a different way, because now we're seeing the wood for the trees, aren't we? We're seeing things for what they really are, because we know who has been most impacted by some of the decisions that people at the very top have made. And where that pushback is met with resistance. And we shouldn't be pushing back. We should just be accepting this as normal. And so it comes back to that all the time, Melanie, when is enough enough? When do we start to challenge and ask the whys? When do we start to ask those questions? If we're not able to empower our children in their earliest years to do that, when? We should wait until we're 40, we should wait until we're in this time of life to start challenging, to start pushing back. I would say that we need to empower children to do that now. And we do that by allowing them to be themselves in their unique individual selves. We should do that. We should encourage that. And we should foster and nurture it by letting them make the decisions about what it is that they want to do. Of course, supporting them, and not for anybody to take that literally, but to understand that when our children are doing things, we recognize that, oh, okay, my child's finding joy in that. Let's do more of that. My child's not really enjoying doing that. My child doesn't want to go to the museum. So why am I forcing them? And if the child enjoys going to, how are we presenting that experience? How are we helping them to make sense of what they are seeing? And are we Obviously, if we're thinking about age, stage, appropriate co-collaboration, co-creating, how are we doing that so it isn't a one size fits all? That experience in terms of having Makaton at setting, is that something that is a knee-jerk reaction? Shouldn't that just exist anyway? I don't want people to start putting up posters in their nursery of Martin Luther King because it's Black History Month. I don't want that to happen. I don't want Makaton just to be used because, oh, now we've got a child in the setting who's deaf. No, I feel that if we're really going to think about creating spaces where we have a true sense of belonging, where we're celebrating the unique child, where we're looking at how children feel like they're a part of something, that should already exist. And we can do that. We absolutely can do it. It allows us to step outside of our comfort zone. It allows us to step outside of this space where we just assume, oh, this is normal. Everybody's going to be able to come through these doors. Well, no. And the presentations, I guess, of disability do not just end at having a book with a child that's in a wheelchair. You know, that isn't it. There is a full range, a full spectrum of things that we need to be starting to interrogate and starting to audit and making things better and making things more readily accessible for all children. This isn't just because we have, you know, as I said, use the example, your daughter started the nursery, or a Black child has started to come to the setting, or a child who, you know, is newly arrived to the country has started the setting. How are we looking really critically at our environments in the early years? Because children are picking up things from very, very, very early on when they're coming into those spaces. Children know when they feel like they belong. Children know when they feel like they don't belong. They know that intrinsically. And they know that because these children grow into being adults who are able to reflect on their early childhood and think, oh yeah, I remember what it was like when I was in perhaps preschool or reception or year one. I remember those feelings of not quite fitting in. No, children remember these things. So it comes back to that, really valuing the child's voice, thinking about the power of that child's narrative and helping them to have an experience whereby they can reflect on their childhood and say, oh, it was a little bit different for me. You know, if we're really thinking about who are the groups that are marginalized, so that there is a different story that is told when those children reach adulthood. It's so important.
It is. It is. I'm conscious of time. We've got like 8 minutes. And I love listening to you because it's such a fresh perspective from the one I've lived my life having. I hope I hope people have enjoyed listening to our exchange this evening. I am not going to ask you how museums can do more to attract early years audiences. I think people using the hashtag should highlight what they're doing already, or challenge each other to make changes or to do things differently. That's not something I want to dwell on here. I wanted to finish on something quite joyful, which a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, I asked people to help me out with what they thought the power of a story was. And so that's something I'd like you to answer in a sec. But whilst you're kind of pondering in the context of early years, obviously, I'll read some of these out. Stories make us human. They challenge our perceptions and let us imagine new ways. Stories are joy, love, community, communication, shared histories, feelings, and empathy. Stories are a tool to see ourselves in the world, to orientate and ground us, and to help us design our reactions and relations to the world. And someone else says they're wonder making, they're community building, they're culture affirming, their knowledge sharing, their time and space travel. And finally, from the inimitable Pi Corbett, they build and guide our moral compass, and they bind us together through shared imaginative worlds. And that was something powerful to end on, I thought, because it brings us full circle back to Wakanda Forever. The article that you wrote, that was an imagined world that your little boy at nursery really grasped hold of. Do you want to reflect some final thoughts on the power of stories?
Absolutely. That little boy who was so enthused and excited and energized by seeing a world reflected to him that he knew so well, because actually that was his world. As much as that was an imagined world, Wakanda, for him, that was reality. And that connection that he felt when he was able to bring it into a setting where lots of practitioners looked like him, lots of his friends looked like him, and those friends who didn't look like him, he was able to share that with them, with that same joy, that enthusiasm. And we were able to celebrate in that by coming into his world. You know, we were invited into his space because of that shared narrative, that connection, and that drawing on those cultural norms for us as a predominantly Black early years space. We were able to share in that joy in a way that was absolutely authentic, in a way that gave him value, and a way that made him just feel good for the whole of that day. You know, his experience at nursery, I always think very fondly about him, and still am connected to him now, many years after. But those things are so reaffirming and so necessary if we are going to think about creating joy in those spaces through a narrative, through sharing and through listening to those narratives, but also being as equally passionate about those things and extending that into the play of the day. Because childhood, it must be about joy, where we can create it, and where we can celebrate it, and where we can make sure it's represented in as many minutes of the day as possible. And so I think when we think about the power of the narrative, the power of children's narratives, and giving them that space to be, one thing that we mustn't forget in that is the power of play, the power of joy in that play, and everybody playing together. That we must all invest in play, whether we are 95 years old or whether we are 4 years old or 3 years, we must play, because in that play, the exchange of narrative is happening all of the time, and we're able to really get down to it, and enjoy it, to celebrate it. I think so much of the narrative around, you know, the Black experience, we know that it's nuanced, we know it's not homogenous, there is not one Black experience. What we must centralize our things on, it's got to be rooted in joy. Too much of it is presented through a narrative of oppression and pain and sadness. There is so much joy to be had. And I think when I wrote Wakanda Forever and I thought about that little boy, that's what I focused on, the joy.
It's a wonderful point to end on, Liz. Something for everyone to take away there, I hope, to bring play into what you do and joy into what you do. It has been fantastic chatting to you. It's been a long time coming, and was a great opportunity to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining me. And thanks to everyone for listening in, watching in. Looking forward to catching up with your conversations on social media soon. Thanks.